Hello, and welcome to another episode of Thoroughly Thriving, where we're putting human back in human capital solutions. On today's episode, we're going to hear from an industry leader where they're sharing their thoughts, feedback, and perspective on what's happening in today's world of work. Well, let's stay tuned and perk our ears up for another exciting episode. Welcome to another episode of Thoroughly Thriving. And the guest that we have on this week's episode certainly epitomizes, embodies what it means to thoroughly thrive. Our guest today is someone who has literally changed what's possible in medicine. Today we have Dr. Shawn Rose, who's the Chief Medical Officer and the Head of R&D at Nkarta. But audience, titles just don't do him justice. This is a physician scientist who has taken more than a dozen programs from the earliest stages of discovery all the way through clinical development. We're talking about approved medicines that are in patients' hands right now. These are therapies that have redefined treatment and immunology and beyond. And his career really is like a masterclass in how to actually build in biotech. He's been at BMS, Johnson & Johnson, where he led registrational programs and shaped rheumatology and autoimmunity strategy at the highest levels. So Dr. Shawn Rose has really been at the forefront and been at the cornerstone of what makes research really go. And here's what makes Shawn genuinely compelling for this conversation. He started at the bedside as an attending physician and researcher at the NIH. And he volunteered in community clinics across Washington, D.C., which really never left him. It shaped not just the science he pursues, but the kind of leader he became. Today, we're not just talking about pipelines and programs. We're going to go deep on leadership and what it actually takes to lead in biotech versus a decade ago. So what I've enjoyed about getting to know him is he's got this passionate, really insatiable hunger for curiosity. And he stays open-minded and curious, and he pursues answers in a really relentless fashion. So this is one of those conversations that's going to be equally practical and inspiring, whether you're just stepping into leadership or you've been in your seat for years. So welcome to the show, Dr. Shawn Rose.
Thanks so much, Darren and Shawn, for this warm welcome and for having me on Thoroughly Thriving. I've really been looking forward to this and having a really great conversation today. And you're too kind, by
the way. No problem. No problem. It is our pleasure and honor. So, look, we're going to kick things off with something that's centric to leadership. So, Dr. Shawn Rose, with leadership in organizations, change is inevitable. And, the one thing that I found being in a professional and being in the marketplace, that change is inevitable, but growth is optional. And leadership within organizations have dramatically changed over the last decade. What do you believe are the biggest differences between leading organizations today versus when you first stepped into leadership roles?
Outstanding question. And you're absolutely right. Change is inevitable. And in the world that we live in today, constant, right? And so we all have to be open to that. Technology changing every day, priorities changing every day, people's view of the world changing and being shaped every day, and the interconnectivity with the technology that we have and how we interact has also changed. So I think, to put that into frame even as little as 10 years ago, right? Let's go back to pre-pandemic days where we didn't have tools like Zoom or Riverside, of the platforms that we would use to communicate, right? What did the world look like then? A much more in-office culture, right? A much more, I would say, top-down culture where, whichever job you may hold, right, you had to sort of go through several layers in your own line management to get endorsement for whatever you were doing. And then all of your team members had to do the same thing in their areas. And you can imagine the complexity that involves. Like if you go back to, when you're a child playing telephone, right? And how messages could change, right? As you had to go through those cascades and then get everybody on the same page, right? And so I would say very hierarchical, very top down. And I think the other thing that's changed, of course, is over time you have new generations who come and go from the workforce. And what we've seen with the rapid rise of the technological revolution over the last 10 years has really changed things dramatically because we have just massive amounts of information at our fingertips, right? And so because of that, management styles that might have worked in the past and leadership styles that worked in the past have now broken that barrier and that ceiling of this hierarchical structure, right? So why do I say that? At a click of a button, you can have AI give you a very intelligent answer that, at this point is 80 to 90% accurate, right? And if you check it appropriately, 100% very quickly. So if your, senior leader makes a statement that was true 10 years ago, right? That could have changed, right? And if your senior leader hasn't adapted, right, to the times and really fact check themselves and their own assumptions, they may be very fundamentally wrong, right? And you can access that information immediately. So how do you manage that situation as a leader, right? Would a hierarchical top-down structure work in that setting? I would argue no, right? Not for your credibility as a leader, not for your benefit as a leader, not for the benefit of your group, and frankly, not for the benefit of your company, right? So layer on top of that the entry of Gen Z, and now pretty soon approaching Gen Alpha, right? In terms of getting more into their career. That's also a major change, right? People's worldview have changed considerably for those that have grown up during that technological revolution. Their attitudes toward the term I like to use, work-life integration, because there is no such thing as balance. It's how do you integrate it and how do you navigate that in terms of what are your biggest priorities each and every day, right? Between home and work, right? And so I think that that has added complexity. And the third major bullet that I would make is what also has changed is expectations, right? Now that we are, especially in the biotech and pharma sector, but I would argue really every sector that one can think of in business, it is much more globally competitive than back in the days, right? And so when you are in that setting where you have serious competition coming with really talented people all over the world, you have to really think about how do you maintain your competitive edge, right? And how do you continue to, hopefully treasure your company, your relationships, your employees, while delivering in a ever-changing, much more complex world, right, than we've ever been in before. And so, I would argue even 10 years ago, management styles, leadership styles, no longer apply, right? And so, situational leadership, situational management is a term I think that comes to mind, right? where not only do you need to know your team really well and your colleagues and other parts of your company and your partners outside the company really well, you have to have a really strong EQ as to which buttons to push when, right? To really inspire people, and importantly, to make sure that you're delivering right on your goals and objectives, right, in the workplace. And so that situational leadership really requires more than ever an open mindset in terms of adapting to constant change. But secondly, situational leadership and knowing people, whether it's different cultural, sex, gender, sexual persuasion, whatever it may be, right? And the different, types of individuals that we work with, you're taking all that into account, looking at people as people, understanding what their sensitivities may be, their backgrounds, their various experiences, right? While you're juggling that, you're juggling an ever changing world and generational, very different views, right? They're generationally in the workforce all at the same time. So that is very unique, and even compared to 10 years ago, I would say it has magnified tremendously.
I would agree with you. And I mean, there's so much gold in that answer in terms of just the way that we have to think differently as leaders. Yeah, I love the situational leadership. I think that that makes so much sense. And I think, you've experienced in your career thousands of different situations that if you painted everything with the same broad brush would not lead you to the success that you have had. But being able to pivot and move and shape and shift with not changing who you are, but allowing your leadership to ebb and flow to the needs of the situation rather than just the holistic, broad situation as a whole overall. So, I mean, I love that answer, Dr. Shawn. And I think, I want to pivot into our next question a little bit because I think you probably have felt this. We know many leaders that we talk to and we interview for this podcast, feel this pressure to have all the answers, whether they would ever explicitly state that, or if it's an implicit feeling of I'm the leader, they're coming to me for guidance and I need to have the answer. But how do you balance confidence and decisiveness? I know you talked about even people on your team now can fact check essentially what you said, or they can take it into different places and compare their answers. How do you balance that confidence and decisiveness in your leadership while still remaining open to new ideas, new perspectives that may allow you to make a decision differently than you may have in a previous situation?
Thanks, Sean. I think you have to constantly balance, um, what you perceive as what you know, right? Versus that tension with that openness that I mentioned, where others may have a different perspective, and in an ever changing world, do you really know anything anymore? Frankly, right? And so, I can tell, for me personally, one of the things I remind myself, and I kid you not, when I get up every morning, is, to sort of start the day and really think through, the more that I think I know, actually, I think the less I know, right? The more questions that open, right? And again, it's that open mindset, that curiosity, that okay, I might have these number of problems in front of me that need solving. Recognizing that no one person can solve every problem, right? So that's why you have teams, right? And you rely on those partners and team members to help you think through things. Um, and so, I think maybe I could take you through my process a little bit, and that'll help answer the question, right? First and foremost, you know, we all have to be open to new data, right, in this world. And I don't care what industry you're in, that applies, right? And it's different kinds of data, right? But nonetheless, it's information, right, that we're gathering. So, and then the challenge nowadays is making sure it's actually good information, right? Because there's this information explosion, right, that we all have to deal with. So kind of starting there, let's gather the information that we need to inform this situation, right? The second is to say, look, we have a team for a reason. Let me gather input and have people sort of express their thoughts and their voices, and then you know, but also that process is important, but at the same time, you do need to fact check each other, right? And some perspectives may be coming from a different position and a different experience, um, but you have to sort of have that dialogue and back and forth of okay, not let's not just fact check each other, but let's pressure test the assumptions behind what you're saying or behind what I'm saying, right? And make sure you're aligning on those assumptions first, because if someone has a very different set of assumptions, you might get to a different answer, right? So there's that process. And then I would say the third piece is making sure everyone feels heard, right? When you are discussing something in a team setting. And that's great to do that. But at the end of the day, what you're getting at is then how do you get to decision? And for me, this is the fatal flaw that I've seen time and time again in various settings and organizations where I work, where people wait too long to make a decision, right? And you just can't get locked into that. You can't be afraid of making the long decision. Instead, what you have to do is take the best information that you have, gather it from various stakeholders, and move forward with the best information that you have. And importantly, understand what the consequences of that decision are, right? That you've thought that through. And if new information becomes available, how would you pivot, right? And actually anticipate that. How might you pivot if that information becomes obsolete? Because in this ever-changing world, that information becomes obsolete all the time, right? And so you have to be adaptable and prepared to pivot. But what you cannot do is waffle and waffle and waffle and not make a decision, right? Because then that's chaos. Your team doesn't know which direction to go in, right? It's sort of the blind leading the blind phenomenon, right? If you can't make that decision. So I think, decisiveness is key. Being fearless about making that decision, knowing that there's always going to be a chance it's the wrong decision, revisiting only when there's new information, right? That challenges that decision, those assumptions, and being open to receiving that and pivoting on a dime when you need to. And lastly, to close the loop, you got to bring everyone along with you, right? And that's part of managing those expectations of, hey, this is where we are today. Let's move forward. We're going to live with this. We're going to own it. But, be prepared, right, down the line, right, should we have to course correct. And everyone needs to understand that that is the expectation, right? And so I do think that we live in a challenging time in that, what are perceived as wrong decisions, right, can lead to really bad outcomes, on the back end for that individual. But, as a leader, you can decide to cower in a corner and worry about that all day, or you can say, you know what, I'm here with this team. We're doing something for a reason with purpose, and so we have to move forward. And I have a good friend. I love this. He turned me on, so I'm going to steal his quote. My friend Bill, and he says, how you can always tell the pioneers, Shawn? It's by the arrows in their back, right? And that's a very true statement, right? If you really want to change the world, you can't be afraid of having arrows in your back, right? You have to be decisive. You have to move forward.
Oh, I love that. Dr. Shawn, I've been told throughout my career that perfect is the enemy of done sometimes, right? So the decisiveness that you talk about, being steadfast, and if we look at this from optimistic through an optimistic lens, what I found in my career that there truly aren't many losses. There's lessons, and when I'm got the analysis paralysis, and I'm kind of in this state of limbo, that's a terrible place to be in. So I've got to remember that perfect is the enemy of done, and I'm going to take a lesson out of whatever situation that I decide to step out into. Um, throughout my career, I've I've really gravitated towards leaders that have this curiosity. And in your intro, I talked about how you have a passion for learning, and you wouldn't be in the role and have the career that you have uh, if you weren't curious. But I'm curious for you. How do you cultivate a open mindset, Dr. Shawn, of continuing to learn, especially after reaching senior leadership positions? How do you kind of keep that fresh and intact, that level of curiosity, which I find is a trait in exceptional leaders?
There's really a lot to unpack there, right? And this is an important concept. I would start with think about when we're all children, right? We're all inherently curious, and then the world sort of teaches us whether you decide to continue to be curious or whether you start closing off, right? And we see this in our friends, our family, right, our coworkers as one goes through life. So I think for me, look, I've always been naturally curious, but again, so is every child, right? That's part of it as you're exploring the world, right? I try to remind myself that, um, whether you're talking about something in your professional life or or at home, that don't lose that, right? And it's really an important, um, I would say, differentiator as you get further in life. I mean, as we age, right, we tend to get locked into routines and habits and ways of doing things and all that. And that's fine, right? It's good. In fact, it's a certain way of being disciplined, right? By doing that. If you can't tell, I did a lot of psychology and neuroscience, major in undergrad, right? So I actually bring a lot of those elements when I think about these things, right? But um, but importantly, you know, our brain, our body, the way we adapt to the world, it does remain plastic throughout our lives, right? Even if we, do sort of become more locked in our personality and our way of, our habits and our behaviors in life, right? So I think for me, how do you stay curious? How do you, it comes back to that open mindset, number one. And number two, you have to challenge yourself and you have to challenge others to really get the best out of themselves. And in a way, that's part of being a curious person, because someone might be telling you a funny story about something who happened at home, and then you get off on a tangent because it triggers something, right, that you're curious about. And maybe that leads to a different conversation, which leads to a brand new idea, right, that you wouldn't have. So I think um, part of being curious is also encouraging others to be curious. And you'd be really surprised that, where appropriate, when you get off tangent sometimes, that can actually be a very good thing, right? And going on these tangents. Now, look, in a business environment, it's all about results, right? So you really got to lock in, but make sure you leave that time in that headspace. And maybe it's not, in the workplace in the middle of a busy meeting because you don't want to waste everyone's time, but maybe it's, you know, getting a bite to eat after work or for lunch or whatever it is, or a walking meeting or whatever you decide to do, right, to get out of that setting. And maybe it's with one individual, maybe it's with a small group or whatever. But take that time, right? And I think if you do that in your personal life and you do that in your professional life, right, and you get to know people and you not only try to remind yourself to stay curious, but remind others, that's where the real innovation happens. That's where the new ideas come. That's where, if it's so easy to get locked into the day to day, every minute, oh, we have all this to do, we got these results to hit. Don't get me wrong, you got to do that, right? But don't forget to carve out that space for curiosity.
Yeah, that's so good. And I love how you talked about curiosity essentially isn't just a limited time or just for the people that you're leading, but it really becomes kind of a across your life, behavior that if you train yourself in every area. And to your point, I love, it seems to me that you, part of the foundation of who you are from what we've gotten to know you is that curiosity is a part of it, because to your point, the information you knew last week may no longer be, the latest data set that you've received. But if you're not curious and willing to ask questions or to learn or to challenge your own perceptions or thoughts, you never really get to. And we think about the greatest breakthroughs in our society often came from society was used to going this way. Someone got curious, asked the question, why do we do it this way? It sparked a conversation. And then the next thing you know, we weren't just horse and buggying anymore, but now we're suddenly in a gas powered engine. And then someone says, wait, we can do this better with an electric engine that can be charged through what we're doing. And, you begin to walk through it, but it's all based on living curious holistically and not just when it benefits you in a small micro environment. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And you have to, and the other thing I want to say is you have to practice it, right? You have to practice it. I always like to give examples. I was on the phone with one of my favorite collaborators last night. And at the close of the call, it was funny, we laughed. And, that collaborator said, um, you know, this is this is our poetic hour, Shawn, right? Because, you know, basically it was a number of ideas that we both had on various topics that we brought to the table, and we just brainstormed and we let it fly, right? And so two curious people sitting down on a number of very difficult topics. How do we solve these problems? How do we be creative, right? And open-minded about how to address these things. And very diverse topics, by the way. And that poetic hour, the results, and this is late at night, right? Because the only time we were able to, have this session. And then it's like, oh, wow, now I've got clarity of what I need to tackle for, let's say we got there in 3 out of the 5 things we discussed. My goodness, was that a good hour spent, right? And you think about, I could have said, you know what, I've got 57 other things I need to do tonight, right? Right. But carving out that hour in the long run will save, days, weeks, I don't know, right? So, and I think this is a challenge. I'll be honest, this is a challenge in the hustle culture, right? That we all live and breathe, because there's always the, I need everything yesterday. I need this. I need the blah, 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 right? Everything needs to be done. And, in my view, there's a place and a time for that. And yes, when the push comes to shove and you've got a task to do, you got to get it done, right? But you have to also balance that with taking the time to say, if, sometimes you go a little slower to go much faster, right? And that's something that is a discipline, and it takes work, and it takes stakeholder management and practice, right? And I think that is something that we all lose sight of at some point, including myself, right? And I think from an organizational standpoint, most organizations in today's business culture are really bad about this, right? They really are. And it's just go, 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 right? And results, 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 results. And they don't take the time to sort of take a step back and say, well, wait a minute. We thought we were heading toward this, right? And now this changed. And so, let's reflect on and reprioritize, right? And sort of adapt to that. So again, sometimes just slowing down a little in the long run speeds you up exponentially, right? And so, yeah, I think especially in American culture, we've gotten very much in the business workplace. And I do think we waste a lot of time and we waste a lot of money because of it. And I think we need to do better.
I love it. Well, that's great. Well, hey, I'm going to pivot the conversation a little bit. I want to talk about something that I know is important to you, which is mentorship. And I think mentorship is something that we talk about. And I think in many ways, if we're not careful, can be a lost art with the access we have to podcasts and YouTube and all, AI and everything else. That, like, it's pretty easy for someone in their career to isolate and find their own echo chamber of information and not truly connect in a actual mentorship role. They've got a million bits of information, but there's much greater value in true mentorship. That great mentorship is really rare. And I think it's always been rare, but I feel like it's even more so in our culture today. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the mentors that had the greatest impact on your career and what made them so effective for you?
Yeah. Well, look, I'm going to start with a quote. If I have seen further, it's by standing on the shoulder of giants. Either of you know who said that? Start with a quiz.
No.
I've heard the quote, but I do not know who it's attributed to.
Yeah. So Sir Isaac Newton is often quoted, but actually Bernard of Charles originated in the 12th century. It's one of my favorite quotes. And it really speaks to mentorship. And just at that, I've been very fortunate in my life at all periods of my life to have had individuals who thankfully took an interest in me, right? And that's always mutual, important. Mentorship should always be mutual, right? It's a mutual relationship with expectations. But I think, and it starts early. It starts early in life. You know, I'll be brutally honest. I was a bit of a free spirit, right, when I was younger, right? And my life could have gone in a very different direction. But I had one teacher who really cared, who I saw way too frequently in detention, right? And who pulled me aside and said, she was also a teacher of mine, but she also manned detention. And at that point, we're like first name basis, and she had the seat waiting for me, right, when I would walk in, and basically said, look, Shawn, I love you, but I'm really tired of seeing you here, right? And so, and she said, you're kind of pushing the threshold. And just so you know, right, you're performing academically brilliantly in my class that you happen to have with me. But I'm telling you right now, if you don't shape up, I'm going to flunk you in that class, right? And if I do that, you're not going to pass this year, right? And so you're going to and it wasn't academic, like it was sort of like, you haven't been here enough, right? And they have grounds to do that, right? And so so that was a wake up call, right? It's like, wow. And and in hindsight, we talked about it because I wasn't in detention anymore after that message, right? And then we talked about it. And I remember as I was graduating, I went up to that teacher and I thanked her, and we gave each other a big hug. And I said, this was a moment that I'll remember because we had plenty of crazy types, right, in the school I grew up in, South Florida, in a very interesting time, an interesting part of the country, right? And so she took the time, because I saw her kind of do this routine with others, but it was maybe done differently because she saw something in me that was like, boy, you're really wasting yourself. What are you doing? Right? And I need to give this wake up call. And I responded, right? And that set me on a path where I started getting very serious, right? It really was that wake up call. And then, went to college and had great mentors there during my journey. One of them strikes me, who was also a teacher of mine, but also my guidance counselor, and said, at that point I'd gotten into medical school, but hadn't started yet. But she pulled me aside and said, Shawn, I'm so happy that you got into med school. That's awesome. but have you ever considered doing a PhD? And I was like, what? Why? Right? That was my response. And she said, well, because you're a scientist. And I said, what are you talking about? And so she sat me down and we talked about it. And I said, I don't have scientific training. I'm not a scientist. What are you talking about? She's like, no, no, no. Being a scientist starts with how you approach the world and the questions that you ask and the curiosity you have and the way you attack problems, right? So you are a scientist. I've seen that. You've been in multiple of my classes now. I've been your guidance counselor. And I said, okay. So she said, I'm going to introduce you to the head of the MD PhD program at University of Miami Medical School, and I want you to go down to the medical center and meet with him. And I got you a half an hour appointment, right? That had a fundamental change on my life. Again, another example where I walked into his office and I said, hello, I'm Shawn. And he said, why are you here? And I said, well, I don't know, because my guidance counselor told me I should come talk to you. Dumb answer, right? Very dumb answer. I would have flunked myself on an interview there, right? But he kind of laughed, right? And he said, well, Lynn doesn't often send people to me. In fact, you're only the second person in the 25 years I've known her. So clearly,
Wow.
she wanted you to talk to me, right? And I said, okay, so let's talk. So what was supposed to be a half an hour meeting turned into a 3.5 hour conversation, right? And I was given, and I was fully sold on understanding why I needed to pursue something more than an MD degree, right? And to really do the PhD training. And then I was held accountable. And Richard, the director of the MD PhD program, said, you have 3 things. I'm giving you 3 things you need to achieve during your first year of medical school when you start shortly. If you don't do these 3 things, and I mean to a T, you will not be allowed in the program, right? And so I appreciated that. That's mentorship. That's not just giving someone advice, but holding them accountable, right, to that. And so, look, the rest was history. I did those 3 things and, in a very atypical path, got into a program, which is not something that happens, right? Usually folks that do this, you're accepted right out of college, and it's very difficult, right, to get into these programs and very competitive, et cetera, et cetera. And I certainly did not have the CV that some of these folks would have had, right, to get into the program. So look, I think this is what that has taught me is, and these are just 2 examples. I won't bore you with the many others, but each step of my career, I always made sure to identify potential mentors, to solidify and cultivate those relationships, to make sure that it was bi-directional, right, and that I was being held accountable to whatever their expectations were as a mentee. And then importantly, what impact has that had on me, moving forward is that not only do I treasure mentorship, but, now solidly middle career, right? You start thinking about, what does the rest of your career look like? And, hopefully there are more accomplishments personally, professionally, but more importantly for the team, for patients, for the many things that we do and why we do this. Less about me, more about others, right? And, but to do that, comes with a responsibility to pay back, right? And to then say, I need to make sure I'm doing a good job mentoring others. And so I've always valued that along my journey. I have many, many, many mentees that I've mentored in many stages of life, career, etc. Passionate about it. One of the things I do now is I coach a lot of youth sports because a lot of these kids are a little bit lost, right, in life, and they really need people who will hold them accountable, but also listen to them, hear them, and that talk over a water break, hey, what's bothering you? How can, let's talk about it, right? And that sort of thing. So I think these are to me, that's what leadership looks like, right? You also have to play it forward, right? And I think it comes with a lot of responsibility to be a good leader and really truly call yourself a leader, that you also give back.
Yeah, I think that's great.
Dr. Shawn, we have time for one more question, and I'm very excited to get your thoughts on this one. We mentioned in the introduction just a bit about your career, um, and one can infer the types of individuals that you've had the opportunity to collaborate with. And I loved how you gave the example of speaking with a collaborator last night. But you've worked with really accomplished scientists, physicians, business leaders, thought leaders, pioneers, and people that really have arrows in their back, as you put it a little bit earlier. You've done this throughout your career, but what have you learned about bringing this these types of phenotypes, the cohort together that have potentially strong personalities and creating alignment around a common purpose, a common vision. Interested to get your thoughts in the last couple of minutes that we have together.
Well, look, I think first and foremost, inspiring people is really critical to that, right? And start with alignment of what is the most important and inspiring thing that you can think of, right? As you're addressing any topic, even mundane ones, right? So if you start there, right, and you're like, what are we trying to solve for? What would good look like, right, on the back end, right? And you align on that. And ideally, not every topic is going to be inspiring. Let's face it. But if there is an element of that, right, and you can inspire that vision, right, that's always a
Or
good
even call it
starting
out,
point.
you know.
Yeah,
Yeah.
call it out. Yeah, right. Sometimes you might call it out. Well, this is what I think is really inspiring. Or sometimes you're like, boy, this is the dullest topic ever. But we still have to solve this issue, right?
Still got to solve it.
Call it out, name it, right? I love it. Yeah. So yeah. So I think just having that back and forth, that dialogue, again, making sure people feel heard, um, but also managing expectations. Like, name what you're trying to do. Are you trying to inform on something? Are you looking for feedback? Are you trying to get to a decision? Are you trying to get to let's just align on next steps, and maybe we don't make that decision today, but we, decide on what additional information do we need, right, to get to a decision, right? And again, I think it starts with that EQ and those skills, and importantly, know who you're in the room with, right? Understand what their considerations might be, and that they may be different than yours. And I think this is, for me, the biggest lesson has been, as you get especially into more and more senior roles, is you have to understand that you don't know that other stakeholder may have information that you're not privy to, right?
Yeah,
That you don't know.
it's true.
And so there are things that are driving their thoughts and behaviors, right? Just like there are things that drive your thoughts and behaviors. And so if you are willing to step outside of yourself and be humble, right, and not have an ego coming into the door, right, then you actually really hear each other, right? And I think the last piece is getting to alignment, is recognizing that you will not own every decision, and that's okay. But you have to at least have expressed, right, what you believe is important. And then when a decision is made, not everyone will ever be 100% happy. Consensus culture is actually very dangerous, right? It's very rare that people get to 100% consensus. It can happen, but it's very rare, right? Where everybody is 100% satisfied with a decision, right? And so if you come in with that mindset, you also have to be flexible enough to say, okay, I said my piece, the decision is made, let's move forward. And you don't revisit it, and you don't sort of back end to, oh, what a dumb decision that was, right? To your colleagues, because, that's a cancer to any organization. So I think living with it and owning it, and, you know, and that is actually a mentality that I do think a lot of people at all levels struggle with, is just living with decisions, right? Even if their viewpoint was not the most popular in the room, and was not, accepted. I mean, at the end of the day, you got to move forward, right?
So true. Well, Dr. Shawn Rose, thank you so much. It's been very insightful for me. I've got a lot of takeaways myself and a lot of great insights around. I love just the idea of living out of curiosity, but also being, you know, confident in your decision making in an informed manner, in a timely manner. I know I'm guilty of that from time to time, of taking a little bit too long to make a decision on certain things, but but also being a leader who brings others along with you. Being willing to challenge yourself, being willing to challenge others, not being afraid to go first, knowing you may be the pioneer with the arrow in your back, and but also giving back to others as a leader is true leadership. So gosh, man, so many things that I have to take away from personally from today's episode. I just want to thank you, Darren, as well. What a great episode! Look forward to having more and more conversations down the road. We have to have Dr. Shawn back. I mean, there's just so much great gold here. So thankful for your time today, Dr. Shawn. And we like to end this episode like we do every other, and reminding our audience, which I think is probably something that hits close to your heart as well, based on our conversation, that here at Thoroughly Thriving, we know that as we continue to work as one, we will win as one. Thanks for joining us for another episode this week.
Thank you for joining us today for another great episode of Thoroughly Thriving. If you enjoyed today's episode, please feel free to share it with those in your world. If you'd like to learn more about the Thorough Group, please go to thoroughgroup.com. And remember that we will all remain thoroughly thriving if we continue to work as one and win as one.